Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of How to Live to 200. On today's episode, I had the opportunity to speak with Stephan Guyenet, a neuroscientist who studies obesity and eating behavior. He's the author of The Hungry Brain, which examines the link between the brain circuits, hormones, and overeating. In this episode, we dig into the details of these neuroscientific drivers, the theory that our bodies have a set weight point for which our brain optimizes, which is why losing weight can be so hard for some of us, and why fidgeting might actually have health benefits. We also learn about a monkey named Uncle Fat and how he's an extreme example of the impact of readily available, calorie-dense foods that surround us in our modern world. The blog post for the episode on livingto200.com has a link to some photos of Uncle Fat, which are definitely worth a look and will scare you off the next bag of chips. We continue to try and bring you perspectives from scientists, inventors, clinicians, and biohackers, so keep the ideas for new guests and topics coming. And now, this is How to Live to 200. Well, Stephan, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Good to be here.
So I was reading a review of your book, which is called The Hungry Brain, and somebody described it as The Hungry Brain explains how modern diet turns us into leptin-resistant junk food-seeking zombies. Let's start there. Tell us more about that book.
The Hungry Brain is the culmination of my research and thinking about why humans overeat. And so it's focused on eating behavior and neuroscience and regulation of body fatness. Those are really the concepts it's focused on. And really, the key thing it focuses on within those topics is the non-conscious influences that drive us to overeat. And so, just to expand that a little bit, nobody wants to overeat, right? Nobody wants to gain fat. Nobody wants to develop chronic disease. And yet this is something that 2/3 plus of Americans do. Actually, more than that if you consider the lifetime risk of obesity and overweight. The lifetime risk of obesity in the United States is about 50%. So at some point in life, about half of people will develop obesity in the United States. And so why do we engage in behaviors that promote this outcome, even though this is not an outcome that we want? And essentially what that highlights is that our behavior is guided in large extent by non-conscious brain circuits that aren't accountable to our conscious goals, conscious rational goals for ourselves. So we have this goal of weight control, we have this goal of being healthy, and yet we behave in a way that betrays that. And so essentially the book is an exploration of those non-conscious circuits, and I break them down into certain categories. So there are some that affect our satiety systems. There are the circuits that run our satiety systems. In other words, how much food we eat at a given meal. There are systems that regulate body fatness. So there's a system of homeostatic regulation. So it's kind of like the thermostat in your house in the sense that it tries to defend a set point of body fatness against changes, particularly against downward changes. And then there's a system that determines our level of attraction to food, I would say. So that's the reward system. And then there are other systems as well that I discuss in the book, but I think those are really the core. And essentially, these things evolved for a reason, but that reason was tens of thousands of years ago. And so, those systems evolved to allow us to basically to efficiently seek energy in an environment in which it's hard to obtain energy. And today we're surrounded by, quantities and types of food in the context of a food environment that's radically different than the one that those brain systems evolved in. And so essentially all those systems that push us toward energy acquisition and push us toward also energy conservation through not, unnecessarily expending energy through physical activity, those systems in our current context push us toward overeating and the gain of body fat. And part of that is the development of leptin resistance. So leptin is a hormone that's secreted by fat tissue that is part of this homeostatic feedback system that regulates body fatness. And essentially what research has found out about obesity is that there's basically two defining characteristics of obesity. One is the obvious one of high body fatness, and the second one is that people with obesity actively defend the obese state. And I'm not talking about on a conscious level. It's not like they're consciously trying to remain obese, but there are physiological mechanisms that are regulated by non-conscious parts of the brain that make it very difficult for them to lose weight. And so that's what we call leptin resistance, basically when this feedback signal from your fat tissue that tells your brain you have enough fat, your brain becomes desensitized to that, and your defended level of body fatness creeps up over time, sort of like if you're turning your thermostat up from 70 to 75.
To use your analogy, you become comfortable at 75, and therefore you want to stay at 75, even though you used to be comfortable at 72.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, if we think about the analogy of a thermostat, with a thermostat, if you set it to 75 and then the temperature goes down to 74, that's going to be detected by a thermometer in the thermostat, and then the thermostat is going to engage a response that opposes that change and brings the temperature back up to the desired state, which is 75. And so it'll kick in the heat, and then it'll go back up to 75. And this is how a lot of things are regulated in the body. This is how our blood pressure is regulated, it's how our body temperature is regulated, and it's how our body fatness is regulated. And those homeostatic regulatory systems are concentrated in a part of the brain called the hypothalamus. And that is the part of the brain that receives this leptin signal. And the leptin signal is proportional to the amount of fat mass you carry. So it's kind of like your thermostat detects the temperature in your house. Well, your brain is detecting the amount of leptin that's in your circulation. And then when that amount of leptin is lower than its the quantity that it's looking for, it will engage compensatory responses, just like the thermostat turning on the heat, to bring body fatness back up. And so what are those responses? They're the things that anyone who's tried to lose weight is familiar with. You get hungry, you respond more to food cues, you have more food cravings, so it becomes harder to walk down the ice cream aisle without, grabbing ice cream and putting it in your cart. Your energy expenditure goes down. So disproportionately to the amount of mass that you lose. So your body basically shuts down your energy expenditure. And all of those things, or your metabolic rate is another way of saying that. And so your body has this coordinated suite of responses that it uses to bring more energy in and to have less energy going out in order to restore your fat mass up to what it was. And this is why you have these weight loss studies where people with obesity will lose, let's say 20 pounds over the course of 3 months or so. And then over the course of the next year or two, you see that most of that weight tends to come back. So someone who starts off with obesity and then becomes lean is going to have a lot harder time staying lean than someone who has always been lean.
What happens in the opposite direction? So you're lean.
Yeah.
And at what point does the chemical signal start to go, if we keep using the analogy of the thermostat, when does it go to 73 or 74 or 75? Does it jump from 72 straight to 75?
Yeah, that's a good question.
How does that work in the brain?
So, so there's a couple different answers to that. So if you look at overfeeding studies where they overfeed people by a substantial number of calories over a fairly short period of time, so like a period of weeks or months, what you see is that people vary greatly in their ability to resist fat gain in that scenario. So you can overfeed people by the exact same number of calories, and in other words, exact same number on top of their typical energy needs, and they'll gain vastly different amounts of fat, like tenfold differences in the amount of fat that people will gain. And so some people are able to, and again, this is all non-conscious, this is all the result of the activity of this regulatory circuit, they're able to incinerate almost every single excess calorie that comes into their bodies, and then other people take every single excess calorie and shunt it directly into their fat tissue.
Is there something you can test to determine these things?
Yeah, so there have been studies on this, and basically most of the variance is unexplained. However, the one thing that emerged that I can remember off the top of my head is that people who are more fit at baseline, like more physically fit at baseline, tend to be able to burn off calorie excesses more effectively. And not because they're exercising more, but just because their metabolism is more suited to ramping up that response, presumably. Although it's also possible that it's just genetic and that people who have this ability also are naturally more physically fit. We don't really know. But that is one association that's been found that explains some of the variance.
Is the word, define the word metabolism. I think we throw it around a lot, but I don't think most people understand what it means.
Yeah.
Or what it means, at least for you as a scientist in this area.
Yeah. It's a good question. So metabolism, as you're alluding to, can mean a number of different things. When I say it, what I'm referring to is energy expenditure. So, and particularly, and you can break down energy expenditure into different components, but if I'm not specifying, I'm talking about total energy expenditure. So the amount of energy that the body, basically the amount of heat that the body produces over a 24-hour period as a result of everything that you do. So your basal metabolic processes, maintaining ion gradients across your cell membranes, digesting food, pumping blood around your body, as well as your physical activity, so contraction of your skeletal muscles.
Can people change their metabolism? And in the 72 to 75, by your definition, does their metabolism in fact change? Is that fixed?
Yeah, so I would say that we don't have a complete picture of why some people are able to incinerate excess calories that they eat and other people can't. But one process that has been suggested is something called non-exercise activity thermogenesis, or NEAT for short. And it's basically a fancy way of saying fidgeting. So people
fidgeting.
Yeah. And so as opposed to physical, like more intentional physical activity where you go jogging or whatever, NEAT would be like little postural adjustments or just like resting muscle tone and things like that. So that's one thing that's been implicated. But I don't think we have a very, I don't think we have a really detailed sense of where all that extra energy goes. We just know that it doesn't end up in fat tissue because you can see that some people just don't get fatter.
And I love your analogy of the thermostat, so I want to keep using that. Would you say that somebody who's moved from 72 to 75, has their metabolism in fact changed at that level? Or certainly metabolic processes would have changed at that level. So go more into that.
Yeah, so metabolism in the sense that I'm using it in terms of total energy expenditure does change. So what you see is that there's a positive correlation between body weight and energy expenditure. So in other words, the heavier a person is, generally the higher their energy expenditure will be. And this is surprising for some people to hear because there's this kind of common prevalent idea that often people with obesity have a slow metabolism and that is why they carry excess weight. But in fact, that's not the case. That's almost never the case. Generally, as long as you're correcting for age, gender, height, and physical activity level, almost invariably a person who is heavier will have a higher metabolic rate than a person who's lighter. And the reason is simply that they have more mass, and that mass requires more energy to maintain, and it requires more energy to move.
How does one measure their metabolic rate?
So there are different ways to measure it. The only direct way to measure it is something called direct calorimetry, and this is very rarely used these days. I don't think it's used on humans at all. But originally, that was the original way to do it back when Wilbur Atwater was doing his research back in the early 1900s on metabolic rate and human food requirements and the calorie value of food. So and still to this day we use the data that he generated. If you look on the side of a box of cereal or other type of food and you see you'll see that on there it will say the energy value of fat is 9 calories per gram, energy value of carbohydrate and protein is 4 calories per gram. Those are values that Atwater's team generated more than a century ago. And what they would do essentially is they would put you in a big room and they would literally measure how much heat your body is producing. And so that's called direct calorimetry. And but since then we've developed more user-friendly methods to do it based on our knowledge of biochemistry. And the most common one is called respirometry or indirect calorimetry, where you're measuring the oxygen uptake of the body and the carbon dioxide output of the body. And if you know a little bit about chemistry, you can then say how much energy has been consumed in the consumption of that oxygen and the production of that carbon dioxide. There's another one called doubly labeled water, where you use water that is labeled with 2 different isotopes. I don't really know the details, to be honest, but based on urinary excretion of those isotopes, you can estimate total energy expenditure. You know, if you don't have access to those technologies, there are formulas that you can use to estimate your energy expenditure based on things like weight and physical activity level.
Is it useful to even know? I mean, if I'm 72 versus 75, it sort of is what it is. If I don't know what I can do to change it.
Yeah, so
assuming in the positive direction, assuming in this case the lower number is better.
Yeah, so I think there are a couple different concepts here. So the 72 versus 75 refers to the weight set point. So that's kind of the level of body fatness that your brain is defending against changes. And then the other concept is your metabolic rate. So generally, I mean, it depends on to know your metabolic rate, whether or not it's useful, depends on who you are. If you're someone who is really quantitative and you want to track your calorie expenditure and your calorie intake and to achieve whatever your goal is, whether it's, you know, fat loss or fat gain or whatever, you can do it that way. So it would be useful in that sense. Or maybe it would be useful for meal planning if you're an athlete and you're trying to hit some specific calorie target to sustain your physical activity, your performance. In terms of the set point, basically, I think it's useful to know whether you're at or below or above your set point. But I think it doesn't really take lab tests to figure that out, and in fact there are no lab tests to figure that out in humans. We can do it in rodents, but it's just too invasive to do in humans. But yeah, you can tell basically, are you comfortable at your current weight, or do you feel hungry all the time and cold and sluggish and you're on a trajectory of gain? Are you struggling to maintain your current weight, or are you on a trajectory of rapid gain? Those would be signs. If you're feeling cold and sluggish, if you have hunger all the time, if you have excessive temptation for food, especially calorie-dense food, relative to what you think is your baseline, then those are all signs that you're below your set point. And those are things that you're particularly going to see during a weight loss attempt.
Based on what you know, how does one change that set point if they are overweight and they're trying to move it back down, or how long does it take to change it?
Yeah, so there are a couple ways to think about this. And you can change your set point both in the upward and the downward direction, in my opinion. And
I assume most people are looking to change it downwards.
That's what they want to do, but what they actually do is they move it upwards over the course of their lives. And so the way to move it upwards is to just kind of go with the flow of American culture and diet and lifestyle. And actually, to get a little bit more specific about that, we don't know all the mechanistic details of what increases the set point. And I have my theories that we can talk about if you want. But in broad strokes, we actually do know some things with pretty high confidence. And that is if you put animals or humans in a situation where they're exposed to a variety of calorie-dense, refined, highly palatable foods that are easily accessible, and those animals or humans are not doing a lot of physical activity, we know that is a scenario that promotes not only fat gain, but the defense of excess body fatness. So it increases the set point in addition to causing fat gain. So it's like you gain fat and you retain fat. You see this in rodents, you see it in bears that are eating human trash, you see it in raccoons, you see this across even primates. Actually, there are anecdotes about primates. Like there's the fattest monkey in the world. His name is Uncle Fat. I think he lives in like Bangkok or something, and he's like the king of his little monkey tribe, and all of his subordinates bring him human junk food that tourists give them, and he just like drinks soda and eats hamburgers and other junk. And he has, are you looking at a picture right now?
Yeah, we have to get that
picture.
Uncle
Fat. And he has this enormous belly. And this is what happens.
I'm thinking about next Halloween already.
Yeah, so just to describe the photo a little bit, he has a belly so large that when he's seated, he can rest his arms on it while he's eating his food. And so, this is what happens to animals. It's what happens to humans when this type of food is readily available. So that's the way to increase your set point.
Do you think that's more about readily available or the style of food, or both, and which contributes more?
I think it's probably both. And just to illustrate why I think that, and this is not, I'm not aware of direct evidence on this, so this is me speculating. But imagine yourself.
We like speculation here.
Imagine yourself in a scenario where the only food available to you is junk food, but you have to work really hard to get it. So let's say, you're living on the African savanna like our distant ancestors did, but instead of tubers and fresh meats and fruits and nuts, there's, hamburgers and pizza and brownies, but it's all like in trees that you have to run 3 miles and climb up this tall tree to get to. So I personally think there would probably be a lot less obesity if that were the setting than in the modern United States. So there's basically two things going on. The first thing is that you have to hit a higher motivational threshold to engage in food-seeking behavior because of that effort barrier. And so you have to be hungry. You have to be really hungry before saying, yeah, it's worth it for me to run the 3 miles and climb this tree to get that brownie. So, and to feel that hunger, your brain has to perceive that your body has lower energy stores. So basically, your tank has to be more empty for you to engage in that behavior. And second of all, you're doing a ton of physical activity to get it. And so I think the ease with which we can get food in the modern world is probably an important part of it.
Is your brain doing a calculation on how much energy you have to expend to go get the food, assuming you know it? Like in your example?
Yes. And
On an unconscious,
yes,
I guess.
On a non-conscious level, because this is a calculation that all animals do, even ones that, don't understand math, like humans, and even humans that don't understand math do it. And actually, biologists have modeled. Energy is a critical component of survival and reproduction. Reproductive success is the currency of natural selection, and so essentially nervous systems have been selected over time to generate efficient energy-seeking behaviors, right? And so there are certain principles that govern efficient energy-seeking in a natural environment, and so brains have been hardwired to generate those, to follow those principles. And biologists have been able to model those principles mathematically to predict foraging behavior of wild animals, including humans. And, when I talk about wild, quote, humans, I'm talking about human hunter-gatherers that don't live in, the modern environment, modern affluent environment like we do in the U.S. And essentially the basic principle that explains most of the variance in foraging behavior, I call it the optimal foraging equation, but it's just an equation that calculates calorie return rate. So it's the value of a food item equals the calories the food contains minus the calories it takes to obtain that food and prepare it and whatever, divided by time. So it's simply just the calorie return rate. And if you apply this equation to human hunter-gatherers, you can do a pretty good job of predicting what food resources they're going to seek in their environment. And obviously they don't think of it in terms of this particular equation, but on some level their brain is calculating this equation and generating behaviors based on it. And the same for many other species that biologists have studied, particularly omnivorous species that have a lot of food choice and have to make these types of judgments. And so yes, the brain does make that calculation on some level, although, whether there is like a brain nucleus that's the optimal foraging equation brain nucleus, probably not. It's probably just some emergent, principle that emerges from many different activities in the brain that come together, but that is effectively the output.
Let's talk about your physical diet and what you have changed based on this knowledge. So let's maybe turn our attention toward performance orientation. So weight loss orientation, but a lot of people who listen to us are performance, quantified self kind of geeks, athletes, people who are pushing their bodies as hard as possible. So let's turn our attention toward what's the advice for those kinds of people and what have you done specifically around that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it really depends on the person. So some people are, from a performance standpoint, are really going to be trying to limit the amount of fat on their bodies. And other people, from a performance standpoint, are really going to be trying to get enough calories in to sustain their high level of physical activity. Like someone who is an athlete, I know for myself, and this is just to illustrate what I'm talking about for myself. If I'm on a bike touring trip, for example, cycle touring trip, I'm burning a huge amount of calories. And if I go for more than a few days, I really need to shift my diet toward more calorie-dense, palatable foods, because those are the only foods that can really sustain my metabolic rate. And so in that scenario, pretty much the best thing I can do for myself is like eat Snickers bars and pizza and Gatorade and all the things that I would strongly recommend against under normal circumstances. So that's one side of it. So I don't think there's really a one size fits all, but for people who are trying to limit their body fatness, I think really focusing on an unrefined, lower calorie density diet that limits some of the worst offenders. Like, I think a lot of people don't realize how calorie dense flour-based foods are, and obviously I think people do recognize how palatable they are, but flour-based foods are some of the most, in my opinion, fattening foods that there are in our diet, particularly once you mix flour in with fats and sugars, like baked goods, like sweet baked goods, like cookies and things. But I think really controlling your food environment, focusing on minimally processed, omnivorous diet, I think that is kind of my blanket recommendation for most people. And then regular physical activity.
We're fortunate to live in the Pacific Northwest, and I think a lot of us end up out on the trail. I know you're a big backpacker as well. What goes in your backpack that everybody else should be thinking about?
I don't know if I have anything real special that I put in my backpack, but I try to do things that are, I try to make things myself, so I don't grab like the Mountain House packs, for example. That's really like my own DIY preference, I guess. And I grow a lot of my own food, so I try to use produce that we grow. So we'll dehydrate things. Like my wife recently dehydrated a bunch of mashed potatoes that we'll use on the trail. I'll bring some oil. I'll bring a fair amount of oil, and I'll take opportunities to add that to the meals that I make, to kind of boost up the calorie density. Whereas normally I would limit added fats in my diet.
What's your favorite homemade, goes in your backpack kind of camping trail meal?
My wife makes these bars that are pretty good out of oatmeal and kasha and peanut butter and dates and honey, and it turns into this really, really dense brick that has lots of carbs and lots of fat. It's all like unrefined natural ingredients, but it's very calorie dense, and it's pretty tasty. So that's something that we enjoy.
What's something that you believe strongly that most people in your field disagree with?
That most people in my field disagree with.
What's something that most of them believe that you think is totally wrong, or you think is going to be found out to be significantly wrong?
I think that I don't know if it's most of them, but I know that some of them believe that the set point cannot be changed or is very, very difficult to change. So in other words, if you have obesity, you can never lose weight and feel comfortable at a lower weight. Like, it's always going to come back. And I don't think that's true. I mean, certainly there's a certain amount of weight regain that you see in long-term follow-up studies. But I think that there's actually quite a bit of evidence that the set point can be changed both in the upward and downward direction. There's actually quite a bit of research, and that research kind of comes out of my own field too. I just think a lot of people aren't aware of it.
What's your perspective on fasting or caloric restriction?
I think any form of calorie restriction for the average American or the average person living in an affluent country is going to be beneficial generally, of course, depending on their current level of body fatness. But most people have excess body fat and are generally struggling against positive energy balance. In other words, more energy coming in than leaving the body. And so anything that relieves that situation is going to be beneficial. And we know that, and we can talk about this in more detail if you want, but I believe there's quite a bit of evidence that excess calorie intake and excess body fatness is probably the number one driver of poor health in the modern United States.
And what would you say for people who are performance oriented, who are not overweight, who are interested in some form of caloric restriction and or fasting?
Yeah, so I would say the jury's still out on fasting. We have evidence in animals that it can be helpful for health. There's not really we don't have any direct evidence that it improves any type of health outcome in humans. Like, there's no evidence that it's going to make you live longer. No direct evidence, I should say. There's no direct evidence that it's going to prevent disease X, Y, or Z. So everything is kind of pretty speculative at this point. However, I will say that we have a bit more evidence on calorie restriction. And for someone who is lean, and I mean really lean, I'm not just talking about someone who is in the lean region of the body mass index scale. I'm talking about like, man with 13 or 14% body fat or less, and a woman with, 20 or low 20s or less. That person is probably not going to benefit a lot from calorie restriction. That's what the research in primates, in non-human primates, suggests. So if you're eating a healthy diet and you're lean, you're probably not going to benefit a lot from calorie restriction in terms of your lifespan, in terms of your chronic disease risk. It might have some effect on chronic diseases, but it's probably going to be pretty minor. Now, then that's what the primate research suggests. If you're on a healthy diet, so there's, just to expand on that a little bit, we have 2 long-term calorie restriction aging studies in primates. One of them, they were on a horrible refined junk diet. One of them, they were on a pretty healthy diet, and they weren't given enough calories to allow them to become overweight. So there was like a normal weight group and then a calorie restriction group on the healthy diet. In that scenario, calorie restriction had very little benefit for anything. On the other hand, on the junk food diet, the control group was unrestricted. They got super fat. They got super sick. Restricting from that baseline on an unhealthy diet and not allowing them to become obese had tremendous benefits. And so that's the real difference that I would say. And maybe calorie restriction would have some benefits, but I think it would be pretty marginal in someone eating a healthy diet who's lean. But if we're talking about someone who carries excess body fatness, we have both animal and human evidence suggesting that it can be extremely beneficial. There are studies showing that people who go on calorie restriction regimens, their blood lipids and blood pressure and carotid intima medial thickness, which is a measure of atherosclerosis or plaque in the arteries, improves to a degree and with a speed that would make your cardiologist give you high fives. I mean, it's extreme. So I think if your baseline is you're coming from, you're the average person carrying some extra fat and you're eating the average diet, I think you're probably going to see substantial benefits.
Where can people find more about you online?
Yeah, so a few different places. You can check out my peer-reviewed research on my Google Scholar page. You can go to my website, stephanguyenet.com. If you don't want to spell that, you can go to wholehealthsource.org. And I'm pretty active on Twitter, and my handle is @WHSource. And on Twitter, mostly I tweet out scientific studies that are relevant to my interests. But also, sometimes I just pontificate.
That's good. Thanks a lot for being on the show today.
Okay, my pleasure.
You've been listening to another episode of How to Live to 200. Thank you so much for joining me and exploring this world together. I get a ton of help from the L200 crew that includes Lauren Krayinsky and Kevin Kirkpatrick. The theme music is composed by Emmett McCann. Yes, that's my nephew. You can learn more about this and other episodes at our website, livingto200.com, or find us on Twitter or Instagram at howtolivето200, where we post lots of photos of cool things. It's early days for this podcast, so we would appreciate any and all comments or telling a friend or two about what we're doing over here. It might be irresponsible for you to keep it a secret. Until next time, eat right, get lots of sleep, keep good numbers, and be looking around the corner for the next big breakthrough. If we're going to live a long time, we better do it well.